So last week or 2 weeks ago, actually, they showed Dark Side of the Ring. I didn't get a chance to really talk about either one of the episodes yet because a lot of stuff was going on, and basically, I don't know what it was. It wasn't just a lot of things going on. It's just that, yeah, we could just chalk it up to that. A lot of things were going on primarily, you know, you know. Things like I had to help out in certain areas, like kind of give advice and help out with certain things, like when it comes to computers and everything. Mostly, how do you open up this or that to access this or that, because a job, you need to do it for your job and to help show your fellow employees and everything what they can do, because they got to do the same stuff and so on and so forth. Just a lot of stuff going on, and as I've mentioned before, graduations and stuff. So just a lot on the mind, a lot on the plate, and just didn't really have time to, talk about, these last couple of episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. So let's talk about them right now, shall we? Now, 2 weeks ago, they showed the Daffney episode, and everybody knew that was going to be a hard episode to get through. Mainly because of the fact of what, she went through. Her real name was Shannon Spiller, I think, or Speller. And, she just went through a lot. And what's unique about her, her story, if you will, is she was a child actress. I didn't even know this. And she appeared, actually, as one of the kids in the Santa Claus movie, the 1985 movie, the one with Dudley Moore and such. And, again, I didn't know this. And she also appeared in some other films. So she had some credentials. And her agent, and I think her family even told her about this mostly her agent, I think, because she had an agent, I believe, told her about, the opening WCW had. And basically what it led to was her taking part, basically in this role, which apparently, from what we understand, was only supposed to be temporary, but it caught on and she became a mainstay, in WCW. And I know this because basically in 99 up to 2000 and all that, the primary wrestling show I would watch was WCW, because I lived in Oskaloosa, Kansas. And the cable outlet that me and my father had, it didn't have USA. I mean, I did watch WWE when it came on UPN on SmackDown, don't get me wrong. But it didn't have, honestly, USA Network. So I couldn't watch Raw. I caught up on everything when it came to SmackDown and UPN, but everything else I couldn't catch up on because, kind of keep steadfast with, because it was on USA, and our cable network didn't have that at the time. They had TBS and TNT, so I was able to watch, Nitro. Nitro was my primary Monday night wrestling show, and that's how I got to see Daffney develop as a character when they teamed up with Crowbar and David Flair and all that. And she just, to me, really stood out as, to me, she stood out as a character that, had the company continued on, she could have really shined. Even if they didn't have a women's division, she could have stood out. She could have been one of those characters, on-screen characters, that stood out and you would want to tune in and watch. And that's the honest truth. But yeah, she was a unique character. And her character did evolve. Her character evolved to where she was growing up and growing up and growing away from David Flair, because David was being manipulated by Stacy Keibler, who was Miss Hancock at the time, and so on and so forth. And it was just a unique, I guess you could say, storyline for the character. And they did a love triangle thing with her, Crowbar, and David. It was very, like I said, very funny and everything and all that. And she had moments. She had her moments. There's no doubt. Bash at the Beach. She had that wedding gown match with Stacy, and that ended with Stacy basically getting pied in the face by a cake by Daffney and all that. And it was just, again, just a fun time. But it all came crashing down, unfortunately, at that time. Now, she obviously being there, she wanted to continue being being part of the business, and she would go to Dusty Rhodes' school for his Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling and train there. And she got good, she got decent in the ring, to the point that WWE. Well, this is actually in between and all that, but WWE did kind of give her, and I do apologize for that vibration, guys. That's a Facebook notification. But anyway, because I'm recording this on my phone. But anyway, WWE did bring her in under the developmental contract as part of their HWA and OVW, and she only made like a few appearances on on some dark matches that they taped for before Sunday Night Heat. So she accompanied Crowbar and everything, and I think they wanted to continue. Had things worked out, I think the plan was to continue that on-screen relationship between the two, going into a tenure with WWE, but that tenure never happened. It never happened, and both were unfortunately let go. But again, she kept training and everything, but it was in between this time frame that she started to develop the bipolar disease. And it mainly became noticeable because she had to call her family and let them know something's not right. Something's wrong. You got to help me. She got to that point where she was having those kind of thoughts that you don't want to have, or you don't wish upon anybody to have, period. So they got her admitted. They got her on some medication to help her out. And she still wanted to continue wrestling, so she ended up, continuing training with Dusty Rhodes' Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling School. But also, she started to compete in Shimmer. Shimmer was, I think it still is, was and still is, a very notable all-female wrestling promotion. And they had a lot of names that came out of there, not just that you know of in WWE or knew of in WWE or even AEW, but you knew of and know of from TNA and so on. And she met Taylor Wilde there. I was surprised they got Taylor Wilde in there. That was kind of cool. And everything, they got Taylor Wilde and everything. So that was nice. That was nice to see Taylor Wilde in there. And then basically, they interviewed some other talents as well, like Lexi Fire. They interviewed Amanda Gonzalez, who also has bipolar. These were women, like I said, that she trained with, wrestled with, teamed with, and Shimmer became, made a sisterhood with in Shimmer. And, they gave their thoughts on Daffney and everything, and how, the kind of person she was. And the kind of person she was, was essentially, she was a very kind individual. She was very loving, very giving, of herself and everything. She was very loving and giving of herself, which was, nice to hear and everything. She was always willing to help others out and everything, when need be, and all that. So it was during her time in Shimmer, as well as on the other independents, where she got noticed by TNA. Now, she had made some appearances in TNA before this, and I'm glad when Solomonster brought this up in his review of the episode, he mentioned that she made some other appearances in Total Nonstop Action. She was in the crowd. Jeremy Borash noticed her, acknowledged her as to who she was from WCW. And then she was brought back she was brought in, I should say, not just brought back, but brought in to TNA full time. But she was playing a parody of Sarah Palin, who was the running mate of John McCain. I think that's his name, John McCain, when he was running for president. She was the running mate for him and all that, to be the vice president. And she was basically, as they would say, a very memeable individual. What she would say, her facial expressions, you name it, her hairstyle, you name it. So TNA decided to capitalize on this and pair her up with Angelina Love and Velvet Sky. I think that's who it was, the beautiful people. And she would be brought in as the governor, if you will, that, we all knew and loved. I wouldn't say love, but all knew about and talked about and we're either fans of or not fans of, you name it. But yeah, she was brought in, and they did that for a while. And I think there was some segment they did in the ring where it was basically, because over time they turned the governor character from being like a heelish supporter and advocate for the beautiful people into a face. They started, slowly turning her into a face, because you would have her paired up with Taylor Wilde and everything. And I think it was over time that they did a segment where they acknowledged who she really was and everything. You started to kind of see that side of her come out, but then she was gone off television. I think they did some kind of angle where the beautiful people got rid of her or something. But, you were wondering what happened. Did they fire her or something? No. What they did is they decided to capitalize on that exposure, on basically her being exposed to be not the governor, but who we all knew but basically be who we were surprised to find out was somebody we already knew. And they decided, from what I remember, to kind of carry that on by having her get paired up with Stevie Richards, who came in as Dr. Stephen Richards, or Dr. Stevie Richards, basically the doctor and consultant of Abyss, and now Daffney. And basically, like I said, they paired them all up to be like a very dysfunctional, odd group or whatever. And basically, she, because of this, would compete in the ring. She got back in the ring. Of course, this being a six-sided ring, it was hard. Basically, that's what a lot of the wrestlers that competed in it said. It was very, very hard. But anyway, she would compete in the six-sided ring. And what she would do is she would compete not just in regular matches, but she would compete in hardcore matches. Yeah, she would compete in some hardcore matches. Even even the first Monsters Ball match for the knockouts. So she competed in there, and she competed against the likes of Gale. She competed against the likes of Taylor. I think ODB, Michin, or Mia Yim, as she was known then. So she competed in there, or even Jade. I think that was her other name too. She went by, but she competed in those kind of matches. And yeah, she went through a lot of pain, either in victory or defeat. But then came that moment at Bound for Glory, during the Monsters Ball match with Mick Foley and Abyss, where Abyss grabs her by the throat. She's on like the second turnbuckle, if you will, of the six-sided ring. And Abyss grabs her and tosses her off, and she lands basically, through a makeshift barbed wire board bridge with thumbtacks, but she hits so hard it causes her to have a concussion and a few other injuries. And they did show what looked to be some backstage footage, unseen backstage footage, of the aftermath of this situation, and Mick Foley going with her to the hospital, where it was pretty much determined, yeah, she did suffer injuries as well as, CTE, concussion, and all that. So what happened is this all basically was a situation to where she wanted to get back in the ring, because obviously she felt, from what I can understand, it kind of helps her a little bit. But but basically a lot of people felt she got back too soon, because basically, of course, she was still dealing with her bipolar, and the wrestling kind of helped out a little bit. But when she was off being injured, of course, it kind of crept back in and stuff. And she was also, at a time before her time in TNA, dating this guy called this independent wrestler called Caleb Conley, I think. And he got emotional doing this, because he did love her, still kind of does love her and everything, even though she is no longer with us and everything. But they remained good friends. They remained very good, close friends and all that. And basically, to get back on point, she obviously, wrestling was like an escapism for her, so that she can not be on that bipolarness, even though when she was in a relationship with Caleb, that became like a central focus, if you will, because, there would be days she'd be okay, and there'd be days she was not. And the same goes when she was in wrestling. Sometimes she'd be okay, and sometimes she would not be, but the medication that she would take during that time would kind of help her out. And like I said, I think wrestling for Daffney was an escapism, if you will, that she needed to get away from what she was going through. But because she became so passionate about the business, she wanted to get back sooner than later, or sooner than sooner than rather than later, I should say. Even though some people would advise her not to, she did. And unfortunately, her first match back, which I thought, to me, I think it was televised, but some say it was a dark match and everything. I thought it was televised. She took on this woman named Rosa Love, who had been getting some screen time on TNA at the moment. This is a woman that did compete in WWE as part of the Mae Young Classic, and she did lose weight. She went under another name. But this Rosa Love, when she faced Daffney, and she was still kind of green, but she was being put in there at the suggestion of Team 3D because she competed and trained at the Wrestling Academy. And what happened, it was during the finish of the match where Rosa just basically, I guess you could say, did the earthquake squash finisher on her or something. And basically she came down on Daffney really hard to where not only did it give her another grade A concussion, another bad concussion, but it re-injured her once again. I think she had some internal injuries or something. She just was basically put back on the shelf, and this time for good, because they basically said after that, you can't compete anymore. And she wasn't happy about that, but again, what are you going to do? And fortunately, she did understand that, something like that, this was probably going to happen eventually, sooner rather than later. And after that, again, they gave her medication and all that. The medication caused her to gain weight. Now, what she did in between, though, is she did stay in wrestling, but she wasn't competing in the ring. Instead, she was a manager. She was manager of a faction in both Shimmer and Shine. And, so she was able to keep herself in the business, and you could tell that being in the business, no matter what capacity it would be for her, either as a manager, authority figure, or in the ring, she was, you could tell that she was enjoying herself. She was escaping a lot of, a lot of the pain she was going through, a lot of the bipolarness, because she would take the medication. But even her fellow wrestlers, like I said, there's Amanda Gonzalez, who also had bipolarness. She would notice that, even with the medication or without it, she would have some on and off days, in the locker room. But when she took the medication, she was fine. And when she'd get in the ring, she'd be normal. Like, again, that was her escapism. So basically over time, again, like I said, the medication caused her to gain weight. And all of a sudden, the fans that supported her at one point, or at least some of them, started to chastise her with comments about, oh, you're getting big, you're this, you're that. And she took it in stride. Give her credit. She took it in stride. But then 2020 came around, and 2020 and a majority of 2021 came around, and the whole world shut down. That's basically what happened. Basically, 2020 and half of 2021, or at least early portion of 2021, the whole world shut down. All because of the COVID pandemic. And, well, this was worse. This was probably the worst thing anybody with bipolarness could go through. And unfortunately, it was too much for her. And then came that fateful day, that fateful night and day. And Salamonster touched upon this. He said he was about to go on live with a review of Dynamite when he started seeing people texting him and telling him what's going on. And I remember hearing about this too, and I'm thinking, what's going on as well? And it wasn't until the next day that we found out the aftermath. And yeah, basically, she had gone live on Instagram, and you could just tell this was not good. And unfortunately, it led to a moment that I'm not going to mention here, but we all pretty much know about and everything. Because by the time the police and the fire department, along with her family, were able to get there, because they were all noticing this too. And the son had to call the dad and everything. When they got there, it was too late. It was too late. She was gone. And the one thing she said, and she even made it clear, years before this, is she wants her brain donated to Boston, send her brain to Boston and everything to be studied for concussion, because it was going to go to this institute that Chris Nurinsky, who used to work at WWE, but had to retire because of a major concussion as well to his head. This institution that he had founded or he helped create, she wanted it sent to Boston. So yeah, unfortunately, it was not good. It was not good. Again, they arrived too late. She was gone, but they did basically fulfill her wishes. They sent her brain to Boston to be studied, where they did find some signs of CTE, concussions, and all that, as well as probably some other stuff that we don't know about. But yeah, unfortunately, it was something that nobody wants to hear about when it comes to those that they became fans of. They've seen on television not even that long ago, or if it doesn't even feel like it was that long ago. So yeah, it's just one of those situations to where it's like, you could see what a disease like bipolarness or schizophrenia or whatever you call it will do to you. And you also could see how worse it gets if you have to go through what a lot of us did in 2020 and up to about midway, early portion 2021. And it's like, now that we all know pretty much the truth about that too, because no matter what the news is saying, you see all these articles on, Facebook with ABC7, this news outlet out of Chicago, New York, and all that, saying, oh, new variants are coming, new variant was discovered, da. A lot of people's comments, in a very sarcastic way are like, yeah, sure, oh, let's get the mask out again, oh, no, fear. It's because of the fact that they realize from what we're hearing now, we were lied to. The disease was out there, and yeah, it was affecting people, even, terminally, but and fatally, I should say. But it was basically, it was being over-exaggerated to the point that, now we see the fact that that over-exaggeration was a bunch of lies. That's all it really was. It was just a bunch of lies. All because of why? Because we wanted who's in the office right now to be back in office? I'm just saying. But anyway, yeah, you could see what that did to her as well as anybody else in that situation. And unfortunately, it was just not good. But thankfully, if she knew God and everything, she's in a better place right now. She's in a better place. And they did end the episode on a high note. They talked about how, again, she was a very giving person because they talked about how she was, she, out of the goodness of her heart, gave this one girl, this Vicky Lyons, I think, who has, since passed away. This Vicky Lyons, who was a young girl who at the age of 4 or 3 got ran over and disfigured by a truck, backing out of the driveway. And basically the doctor said her life's never going to be the same. But one of the things Lyons was a fan of was wrestling, and she wanted to wrestle. She wanted to train for that. And Daffney heard about this, and out of the goodness of her heart said, I'm gonna make her dream come true. And if you go on YouTube, you can find the match with her and Vicky Lyons. And Daffney put her over. And it wasn't even in front of a big crowd or anything. It was like very small community center, maybe about 50, 60 people, something like that. And Daffney put her over out of the goodness of her heart. And now they can pretty much match up against each other all they want, in the big ring in the sky, if you know what I mean. But yeah, they ended it on a good note, on a high note and everything. And I don't think anybody could ask for anything better. But yeah, it was a very emotional, very somber episode. everybody was emotional. Amanda Gonzalez, Taylor Wilde, Lexi Fire. I think there was another girl they interviewed. Jim Cornette they talked to, I believe. Her family, obviously. And yeah, very emotional, very somber. Probably the darkest of all the Dark Side episodes this season. But yeah, I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it already. And until next time, guys, let me know what your thoughts are overall. And until then, I am out. So to follow up on the last Dark Side of the Ring review I did, I want to talk about the one that I finally did get around to watching, which premiered last week, but I didn't get really a chance to see it, even though I DVR'd it. But unfortunately, my DVR recording got deleted, for reasons. Again, my situation. You've been watching me for 17 years. You understand that. But anyway, it was on Muhammad Hassan, basically Mark Campagno's character that he portrayed in WWE. Now, what's interesting, though, is when Mark what's interesting, actually, is that before he became Muhammad Hassan, he was known as Mark Magnus in OVW. The same OVW which trained and brought us the talents of Randy Orton, John Cena, Brock Lesnar, Batista. They went through, and this is the name of the list of talent that they went through and talked about in this episode. But he was known as Mark Magnus. And he was basically presented, you can kind of tell that he was kind of started off as a face and then went into being an arrogant heel and all that. And basically he was the OVW world champion, or at least the equivalent of the world champion. Well, the people they got for this, to talk this over was, people that worked at WWE at the time, worked in developmental at the time, came from developmental, but also worked with Mark on the main roster. People like Gene Snitsky, they got Chris Masters, Chris Modetsky, if you will. And I didn't even recognize Snitsky because he was all, his beard was down there, it was all gray. I'm thinking, who's this guy? And then he says who he was. I was like, that's Snitsky? They also got Maven for this as well. They got one of the former writers at the time, or one of the writers who's now a former writer at the time for WWE. And they got Johnny Pollock, I think his name, and Jim Cornette, of course, because Jim Cornette was in charge of OVW at that time. And what happened is that Jim recalls, him getting a telephone call from WWE and obviously from Vince and everything. And basically he was told that they want to bring Mark Magnus up, but they want to rechristen him as Muhammad Hassan. And Jim, basically, as he said in the episode, was on the phone going like, well, he's Italian and from Syracuse. That doesn't make sense. He's Italian, he's from Syracuse. And the person on the other line, who we could assume was either John Laurinaitis or Jim Ross or Vince McMahon, I'm probably going to go with Laurinaitis and McMahon, said, well, now he's Arab American. So they tested this. They tested out his new regime and everything, or not his new regime, but his new gimmick and everything down in OVW to see if it got over. And it got over pretty decently, I guess you could say. He got the heat and all that. They even showed a fan, I think a Planet fan, if you will, attacking him, showing fans turning their back on him because as they showed one promo off with another wrestler, we don't know who this one was, this one guy said, you turned your back on your country and everything and all that. So, yeah, he was basically portrayed as an Arab, Muslim, Islamic supporter and everything that was supporting more of them than anything else. So, when they brought him up to WWE, they started doing the vignettes. And I can tell you, I remember watching when these vignettes came on, I'm like, what is this? And even I'm like, be honest with you, I was like, oh, this is a little interesting. Because as they've acknowledged here, all of us will still, even though it was like not even 2.5 years later, because this guy was brought in, or the vignettes, I should say, was starting to be I guess you could say, brought about around mid 2004. We're not even 3 years in. So it's like, okay, this guy, this is interesting. This is a little interesting, a bit of like, a little iffy, that. But the way they were trying to portray him, was he was somebody, at first, from what I can understand, his character was like, don't judge me for what my people did, judge me for me. In other words, he's trying to be like a baby face, a heelish baby face, like a Kurt Angle, but more serious, more like somber. Like, he's saying, hey, don't judge me for what my people did, or what certain members of my people did, judge me for me. And, honestly, that's what, that's what's kind of what he was trying to do. Throughout some of the first vignettes he did, and they showed some of those, he tried to get it across as a character, hey, I'm an American just like all of you and everything. And, I don't want to be judged for what happened and this and that. But over time, the reactions people would give these vignettes were negative. Fans did not like this guy almost immediately. And WWE at the time, when they would realize, and what the reaction of the fans was, I got a little tongue-tied there, guys. But when they would realize what the reactions of the fans was towards anything, thankfully at that time they would run with that reaction. They'd be like, okay, they don't like this guy, or they like this guy. They don't like this girl, they like this girl. They would run with the reaction. So when they saw, obviously over time, that these vignettes were not working to gain sympathy or make people understand, hey, this guy is not a bad guy, he's just misunderstood and all that, they decided, okay, let's just make him a flat-out heel. Let him really just tear into America and all that. Let them know the truth. Let him just, go to town, if you will. And that's what he did. And him being paired with Sean Daivari really worked, in my opinion. And the reason he was paired with Daivari is because Daivari could speak Farsi. So that worked. And everything. And basically, this all led up to him debuting on Raw in a confrontation with Mick Foley. And Mick Foley was doing a book plug, as well as talking about the troops and how they're sacrificing all this, and all this stuff for us, for what's been going on and the war we were in. And basically, that's when Muhammad debuted, and essentially that's when the ball started rolling to try to push this guy, straight to the moon. Push this guy, to the top and all that. But what happened, though, over time is, that the character evolved, but evolved in a way that obviously was going to gain a lot of controversy, a lot of negative publicity, and that's exactly what happened. Because Mark says that, they were told, him and Daivari were told to stay in character. They were told to stay in character, even when they would go to the airport, so they would be out in public, stay in character. Kind of do the old school thing, right? So that's what they would do. They would stay in character, and this would make people fear them. They even talked about how one woman had her child with her and walked around them because she did not want to be she didn't want to be near them because of what they looked like or what they represented. And they even said that there were some people in the back of a plane, when they'd be on a plane, calling up the loved one saying, I love, no matter what happens here, I want to let you know I love you and everything, because they weren't sure about they weren't sure about him, because even though he was Italian, his skin coloring gave off the representation of being Arab, and that wasn't the case. But yeah, they basically went over the fact that he just had a very hard time portraying this character in and out of the ring, and sometimes knowing that you were going to get pushed to the moon, you're going to get a little full of yourself. And that's what happened, because basically what happened is that he had a confrontation with Eddie Guerrero. I wouldn't say confrontation, but he just went up to Eddie because Eddie was a heel at the time. Eddie had just turned heel in this feud with Rey Mysterio, and he told Eddie Guerrero, "Hey, do you know that the camel clutch is my finisher?" Because Eddie was using it as well, and Eddie Guerrero, that is, had to tell him, "Well, my grandfather, I think it was his grandfather, they mentioned, had used the camel clutch as his finisher and actually invented it." So basically, it's like, it was something you weren't supposed to do. And as a result of that, as well as a few other things that he shouldn't have done because of his arrogance, he got taken to wrestler's court. Wrestler's court, of course, is where you have the wrestlers kind of, just bring it to you. They don't do anything mean or anything. They just, they just lash out at you. They let you know how they feel about what you did. They bring up things and all that, what they could cause and all this. So yeah, basically they let him know. They let him know that, hey, you shouldn't have done this, and this is what your punishment's going to be. And the punishments sometimes, are not that bad. The punishments are more like, hey, you got to do this, or you got to do that. In his case, it was by $1,000 worth of drinks in Japan, because this is where the incident took place. And he did that, but what some of the guys did is they dumped those drinks, expensive drinks, by the way, on the floor. And basically, Eddie went up to him and said, hey, we're good now, don't worry, I know you didn't mean it, we're all good. So that was nice of Eddie to do. But still, you could just tell being this character, being pressured to be this character was a hindrance. It was being a hindrance on him. And even the former writer was like, look, this is not good. And it got to a point where he had to tell his boss, and we're assuming it was Vince McMahon or John Laurinaitis or whoever, that they're not on board with this anymore, that this just does not work anymore. This is not, this is not going to be something that is going to go over, very well. It's going to backfire. And basically, because he talked back to the boss, and basically he spoke his piece, he got demoted. And that was the one message here too. That you could not speak up about how you felt about something, or else you'd be in trouble. Because even Mark said he spoke to Stephanie about one of the situations they were going to go through, Stephanie McMahon that is, and she basically told him, hey, in his own words, this is the way he phrased it, I should say. This is the way he phrased it. He said, in his own words, shut up, we know what we're doing. That's how he phrased what Stephanie was telling him when he was trying to tell her, hey, I'm not comfortable with one of the things you're about to have me do. So, anyway, they go over him, having his, not a match, because I will say this, I don't like how they kind of pictured it as, oh, he's going to be involved in a match or something like that with Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. It was a segment. Let's get that through. Let's get that clear. But yeah, they went over that. And the reason they did that was basically, one, Hogan had just gone into the Hall of Fame the night before. And two, they wanted to do the American Hero against the Foreign Menace, just like they had done in the old days, like with Iron Sheik, Nikolai Volkov, and so on. Heck, they even went through a history of American citizens, even military personnel that turned wrestlers, that because of the way they looked and acted, were portrayed as foreign heels, or basically turncoats. They brought up the Sergeant Slaughter thing, and all that. And, they brought up the I'm just checking something here, folks. I'm trying to do this before, my time is, I'm trying to do this before I can't have any more time to do it during the evening, because again, you follow my channel for 17 years, you understand what I'm saying. But anyway, they do go over the whole Sergeant Slaughter thing, and when he did the turncoat deal, and that basically Vince thought that, they were going to sell 100,000 tickets at the LA Memorial Coliseum because of that, when in fact they didn't even barely crack that, and that's why they had to move it to the sports arena. Because they couldn't crack Vince couldn't crack number-wise what he was hoping for. And then there's other stories to go along with that as well. But point I'm getting at, long story short and everything, basically that's what they wanted to do here. That's what Vince's intention was. Make this guy the foreign menace, but push him, put that rocket ship behind him and push it. And that's what they did. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Mark said that over time, and they even showed some clips from Sean Devari's RF shoot interview he did years ago, talking about, the same things they were bringing up on the episode. And Mark basically said that over time, his character was, again, evolving. And it was getting to a point to where obviously Vince, we could single it out to be him, was telling him to be more, to get more into, basically, the Islamic side of things, the more terrorist Islamic side of things of the character. And, that's when they had him, and he even showed doing it himself to kind of give a demonstration. But they showed a match he had with Shawn Michaels where he did the whole, thumb, the whole thumb across the throat situation. You get the idea. The whole thumb thing, and basically, everybody knows The Undertaker would do that. The Undertaker would do that, or Arn Anderson back in the day would do that, and even still does it if he gets involved in storylines. But anyway, they brought that up. And everything, but the way, he was doing it and the way it was described, it wasn't identical to what Undertaker would do. Instead, it was more of what was acknowledged as to what was happening in the Middle East at that time. And they did talk about how that really wasn't, how basically even the wrestlers along with the fans were like, ugh, that's not good. Because there was, real life situations dealing with that in the Middle East at that time. Several Americans, on camera and not on camera, had this unfortunate situation happen to them. I'm trying to be as clean as I can here, folks. But they had that unfortunate situation happen to them. So yeah, bringing that onto television for your character, not good. Anyway, they bring that up, and then they bring up the fact that he got drafted to SmackDown. I didn't talk about the fact that, when he started his program with The Undertaker, that he had been drafted, but the short end of it was he had been undefeated up until he faced John Cena for the WWE Championship, and he lost. They did show him getting pinned by John Cena on Raw, but that was going to be his last match on Raw before he got drafted over to SmackDown. And you can find it here on YouTube, but he gets drafted over to SmackDown on the same night. That's, the same night that Teddy Long was booking, a five-way match, a five-pack challenge, if you will, a fatal five-way, we'll put it that way, fatal five-way for the, to crown the newly christened SmackDown champion. But as we find out, the following week, that wasn't necessary because Batista got drafted to SmackDown. And again, they kind of skipped over that, but that night when you had JBL, Big Show, Booker T, Chris Benoit, in the ring, all basically being slotted into this match, all of a sudden you hear Muhammad's music, and it's revealed that he got drafted to SmackDown, and Teddy's like, hey, this is a different place. This is not Raw. This is about opportunity, so I'm going to slot you in as well. And he made it a six-way. Which is still stayed as, even though Big Show the following Monday went to Raw, but in his place was Christian. Go figure. But anyway, to get to the point, basically, they talk about how being on SmackDown Because again, they didn't go over him being drafted because they just went straight into, okay, he's going to be in a feud with Undertaker, which would lead to a feud with Batista. And they did mention the plan, which we already pretty much knew about at that time. Because, yes, there were leaks and everything. There was information being leaked out that they were planning to put the world title on him at what was it, Capital Punishment, I think? It wasn't Capital Carnage. I think it was Capital Punishment or something like that in 2005. I think it was called Capital Punishment, I believe. I can't remember the name, but it was a pay-per-view in Washington, D.C. called Capital something. And basically, the plan was for him to become number one contender and then beat Batista for the title in Washington, D.C. as a big screw you, F-U, to the USA. But then real life hit. Real life hit because as part of this feud with The Undertaker that would have led to a number one contenders match at the Great American Bash, which if we are to take everything they said in this episode into consideration, was going to have Muhammad win, and then he would win at the next pay-per-view and become world champion. If we are to believe that, we are to believe that. If you get the idea, if we are to believe that, and we should, based on this coming from them, from the actual sources, then if we were to believe that, like I said, then Muhammad, then basically had real life not intervened tragically, then Mark would have had the biggest year of his year of his wrestling career. He would have had the biggest summer of his wrestling career. We'll put it that way. But unfortunately, real life struck in London. That's right. The real life struck in London because SmackDown at the time, unlike now, was taped on Tuesdays and would air on Thursdays or Fridays. Mostly Thursdays at the time and then later Fridays. So SmackDown was taped, and the day it was going to air, the day it was going to air on UPN, that's when the London situation, the London situation, if you want to look at it that way, occurred. The London tragedy or whatever. The London tragedy. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. With all due respect, God knows I'm not. I'm trying to make this as clean as possible for the YT. But anyway, basically, long story short, to get back to the point here, basically, the situation, the unfortunate situation in London took place on the day that SmackDown was going to air their Tuesday taping on UPN. And it was during this Tuesday taping that there was a segment that, well, let's just put it this way. After the segment was done, did not go over well with UPN or anybody else. Because they had to put a scroll, WWE had to put a scroll across the screen saying, basically talking about, the fact that in light of what happened in London, viewer discretion is advised, because they instead of doing the right thing, to me, when I look at this, I'm thinking all you had to do was cut this moment out. That's all you had to do. You have your WWE.com, right? You could have aired the segment there, no questions asked. But they didn't. Vince McMahon decided, nope, we're going to air it all together. And what happened? Despite the fact that you put a scroll saying, hey, in light of what happened in London, viewer discussion and advice, instead of cutting that moment out and putting it on your own website, what happened? You got a tremendous amount of backlash. And this here, even back in 2005, should have shown people how stubborn Vince McMahon was. Because again, just like that former writer said, he stood up to Vince, and this was around that time he did it, saying this was not going to go over well, and what happens? He gets demoted. He gets demoted for speaking his mind. And even Mark, when he told Stephanie he was uncomfortable with what they were going to do and everything when he got to SmackDown, she said, oh, don't worry. Hey, keep your mouth shut. We know what we're doing. This showed you how wrong they were, or how afraid they were. Because you know what? going to be honest with you, I think Stephanie knew what Mark Campagno was telling her to be true. I think she did internally agree with him. Like, yeah, this is stupid what we're about to have you do, but there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not the boss. That's what she was probably thinking in her mind. Like, this guy's right, but I can't do anything, because because even though he's my dad, he'll fire me. So yeah, it just shows you how stubborn Vince is to not realize, what you had here basically should have not been aired in the first place. Again, you want to have it happen? Fine. You had your own website. You had your own website then and still now. You know what I'm saying? Except for YouTube. You didn't have a YouTube at the time. But you had your own website. You could have plastered it on your real player or whatever your media player was at that time. But you didn't. And because you didn't, Vince McMahon, because of his stupidity, his stubbornness, killed this guy, ended and killed and wrecked and ruined this guy's career. That's what happened. He wrecked this guy's career, all because of his stubbornness. So, basically, we all know what happens from here, right? UPN, along with other places, are not thrilled with WWE. UPN basically threatens not to air SmackDown anymore unless Muhammad's character is taken off. Muhammad and Daffney's character is taken off. And guess what? They are. And we don't see Muhammad until basically Great American Bash, where essentially he gets the living SHIT beat out of him and then last rided right through the stage. Excuse me for a second, guys. Sorry about that, but like I said, basically, he wrecked his career, because he was too stubborn to realize or acknowledge that, to potentially maybe preserve the guy's career, he could have just not aired the segment and just put it onto the web page. That's it. And maybe put a warning saying, hey, what you're about to see was originally meant to be on UPN, but because in light of what happened in London, we're going to air it here, so on and so forth. If they would have done that, I think, things might have, not saying they would have, but might have turned out okay. But, that's Vince for you. And obviously, again, even back then, he was too stubborn to understand that sometimes, things that worked in the past don't work in today's society. And this is 20 years ago. 20 years ago this summer, actually, that this all took place. So yeah, obviously, Vince thinking, I know better than everything else, or everybody else, when he says that sometimes even in character on television, rings true in real life. But again, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with Vince? Well, unfortunately, it looks like Vince is going to probably be spending the rest of his life behind bars. Let's put it that way. But anyway, yeah, he just, basically he said after that and everything, he just went home because he had like a residence or he had family he could stay with in Buffalo. Went home and took time to himself to kind of think like, okay, where am I going to go from here? Because he wasn't sure. He was going into this, like, I wouldn't say depression, but it's basically this sense of loss. Like, I was like, where do I go from here? And then they didn't say this, but I think, my honest opinion, I think God spoke to him. I think God, he didn't say it himself, but I think, spiritually, God put an angel around him and said, go back to school. Go back to school, get your teaching degree, and move on with your life, and you'll be better for it. And that's what happened. He went back to school and got his teaching degree, and he went on to be a teacher, went on to be a principal, and it's been basically a life changer for a lot of students and the small community he's a part of. So yeah, that was so to me, that's a nice positive way of ending the episode. Now, they didn't touch upon this, but he did make about a few appearances in ring, independent-wise, still coming out as Muhammad, but I think a couple of these times he was cheered, because by the time he made his return, over like a decade or so later, or a little over a decade or so later, people were cheering him because they understood his story. Even before Dark Side of the Ring covered it and all that, he would do these shoot interviews with Hannibal. He would do this. He did an interview, the first of 2 interviews with Chris Van Vliet, and so on. And by doing these interviews and all that, people got to know who he was and what he really felt about this whole situation. And now they know even more so with this episode of Dark Side of the Ring, the season finale episode, if you will. But overall, I liked it, and I'm glad he's in a better place. But like I said, he's made some returns to the ring independent-wise, and he's actually gotten some cheers because, again, people understand what he's been through, what he dealt with, and all that. So, that was pretty cool to see. That was pretty nice to hear and see, in my opinion. But let me know what your guys' thoughts are on the season 6 finale for Dark Side of the Ring. How did you feel about it? Do you agree with me, honestly, that, maybe his career could have been preserved had maybe they just took that section of the episode out, put it on the web page, on the media player on the website, and basically put it to, like a discretional warning and all that, and telling why it's only here? Do you think maybe that could have salvaged it? What are your takes? Let me know. Let me know down in the comment section as well as the live chat during the premiere. Like the video, ring the bell for notification, if you will. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, click on the links in the description, guys, to help me out elsewhere here outside of YouTube. But yeah, that's all I can say, guys, on this season 6 finale of Dark Side of the Ring. I'm Muhammad Hassan. Let me know what your thoughts are. And until next time, guys, I will talk to y'all later. God bless. Take care. And I am out. And I'll talk to y'all later.